Hey Soko family, Paperboy is back again, and today I'm going to do another response to a person who, like in the clip we just watched, was out for the count and got back up. But this time, there won't be any getting back up again. So I'm going to address the claims he said in his response. So let's first start off by listening to what he had to say.
So I've come to realize that a lot of these people that make responses to EF Tower, the streams that we've done, they do 19-minute videos and they all repeat themselves for that entire 19 minutes. So in less than 1 minute, I'm going to deconstruct the 4 points that he brought up.
In less than a minute, he will deconstruct the 4 points that I made. Okay, take your best shot.
So in the first place, he said that Ijaz, I depend on argumentum ad ignorantium in my debates with people. That is, I appeal to the ignorance of others. That is not the case. Why? He mentioned Jonathan McLatchie as one example, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. In my discussion with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, you would understand the way that logic works is when you make a claim, you must qualify it to prove your claim. That is how deductive logic works. You make X claim, you follow it with a reason. You make Y claim, you follow it with a proof. And then that leads necessarily to a standard conclusion. That is not the case here. Why? Because when I spoke with Jonathan, he made a claim and he could not qualify it. In response to him, what I did was I cited an evidence. I cited Codex Washingtonianus, and I gave the verse in which it mentions what the statement I made was. So my claim was based on evidence. His claim was not based on evidence. Therefore, I am not appealing to his ignorance.
So he says he does not appeal to ad ignorantium, and then said the following.
You would understand the way that logic works is when you make a claim, you must qualify it to prove your claim. That is how deductive logic works. You make X claim, you follow it with a reason. You make Y claim, you follow it with a proof. And then that leads necessarily to a standard conclusion.
Well, Ijaz, it seems like you do not know how logic works yourself, because the first rule of logic is you have to first get the facts and the premise of your point right. What was discussed here had nothing to do with Codex Washingtonianus, which contains the Gospels. The context of the conversation I mentioned was about 1 Corinthians 15. So let's have a listen to what was actually said and not according to Ijaz's deluded imagination.
I was disappointed in watching the first video that you did on the crucifixion, that you spent a lot of time dealing with some of the secular historians, Tacitus, Josephus, when really that's not the meat and potatoes of the case for the crucifixion or the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. In biblical scholarship, the meat and potatoes is, of course, the primary sources which we have in the New Testament. So I want to deal with one example from the New Testament, and that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is one of the letters of Paul that he wrote from Ephesus in the early to mid-50s of the first century. And he says from verse 3 through 8, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me."
So let's apply the use of logic here as defined by Ijaz. Here Jonathan makes a claim. He bases this claim upon a primary source as evidence, which is the letter of Paul to the church in Corinth. He follows with a reason to support his conclusion. Simple. So let's continue.
And so when we're evaluating the historicity of the crucifixion question, we have to come to adjudicate how was it that Paul came to claim that Jesus had in fact been crucified? What best explains that fact? So the competing hypotheses, I think, which are on the table are that that Paul made it up, he deliberately lied about it, or that he was honestly mistaken, he'd received phony information, for instance, or that this is some later interpolation to the text. You'd have to make a case for that, or that in fact he claims it because Jesus really was crucified and indeed was raised from the dead. So which of these alternatives would you subscribe to? I mean, obviously Paul was someone who was personally acquainted with Jesus' brother James and with Jesus' closest disciple Peter, and so he was in a position to be in the know as to what was being claimed and asserted by by Peter and James and the 12 apostles, etc. So how would you explain the origins of Paul's assertion of the crucifixion of Christ?
Jonathan, if you could just answer me briefly, what is the date for those manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 15 that you're appealing to?
Well, the book of 1 Corinthians was written in the early to mid 50s AD from Ephesus.
But what is the earliest manuscript that you have on that?
I don't know. I'm not a textual critic. I don't have that at my fingertips.
So P46 is from the 3rd century. I'm actually looking here in my NA 28, and some of the variants used in Paul's letter actually comes from Sinaiticus, the second character.
Okay.
Which, let me just finish my response, Johnson. As you would understand, I did not interrupt you when you were speaking. You can at least offer me the common decency there. I look here at Aleph 2, which would be from the 7th century. So when you say that Paul wrote this, what recension or what version of Paul's work are you appealing to historically that you can validate?
So instead of answering Jonathan's question and responding accordingly using the laws of logic which he himself defined, Ijaz's response was to ignore a perfectly legitimate question and take us straight into the twilight zone with his answer that goes into ad ignorantium. So let's listen to Ijaz's statement again.
Jonathan, if you could just answer me briefly, what is the date for those manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 15 that you're appealing to?
Well, the book of 1 Corinthians was written in the early to mid 50s AD from Ephesus.
But what is the earliest manuscript that you have on that?
I don't know. I'm not a textual critic. I don't have that at my fingertips.
So P46 is from the 3rd century. I'm actually looking here in my NA 28, and some of the variants used in Paul's letter actually comes from Sinaiticus, the second character.
So again, we see how he totally avoids the question of what hypothesis he subscribes to, so Jonathan can deduce his reasoning for his conclusion. But he takes Jonathan on a tangent, asking what is the earliest manuscript we have, and then goes on to say the earliest manuscript is P46 from the 2nd century. But what is the relevance of this question if he is not appealing to ad ignorantium? By diverting the focus to which recension Jonathan is appealing to is totally irrelevant to the discussion. Why? Because Ijaz, like all scholars, know that the text of 1 Corinthians is stable, with no significant variants that affect the creed that Paul refers to regarding the death of Jesus. So Ijaz, let me ask you, so it is clear to the audience, what bearing does the recension Jonathan is appealing to have on the claim that he makes of Corinthians being an evidence for the crucifixion? And the second question is, are there any variants for 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5 that would cause us to doubt the validity of this statement, the stability of the text, or the authorship being attributed to Paul, which was confirmed by internal evidence and Clement of Rome? When we look at 1 Corinthians 15:3, we see scholars like James D.G. Dunn in his book Jesus Remembered say that we can be entirely confident that this tradition was formulated within months of Jesus' death. Atheist scholar Gerd Ludemann states, the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3. The formulation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 falls into the time between 30 to 33 CE. Atheist scholar Richard Carrier, when discussing the dating of this creed, he says, there is no refutation of this claim, other than maybe possibly it originated later, which is the fallacy of possibiliter ergo probabiliter. It is possible, therefore it is probable. In fact, the evidence for this creed, dating to the very origin of the religion, is amply strong, and there is no reasonable basis for claiming otherwise. And this is why we see Jonathan tries to interject and identify what point Ijaz is trying to make by bringing up the question of which recension he's appealing to.
I look here at Aleph 2, which would be from the 7th century. So when you say that Paul wrote this, what recension or what version of Paul's work are you appealing to historically that you can validate?
So remember, This point in the discussion was about using the New Testament and Paul's letter as a witness to the crucifixion. Now, Ijaz knows the date of the earliest manuscript, and in trying to sound smart, says that some of the variants in Paul's letter come from Sinaiticus, and then asks what version of Paul's work he is appealing to, which Jonathan can historically validate. So when Ijaz makes this statement, there are two possibilities. If he is implying the recensions cause the statements in Corinthian to become unreliable, then Ijaz is appealing to the genetic fallacy, or he is appealing to ad ignorantium, because even though there is no manuscript for Corinthians older than P46, this itself would not be a sufficient argument to negate authorship being attributed to Paul, or its reliability using historical method. So we can even throw in possibilita ergo probabilita. This is why the scholarly consensus on the creed is so adamant it's a historical statement. So Ijaz, which option are you appealing to? 1 or 2? And then we continue, and the fallacy of Ijaz's argument becomes apparent.
So you're contesting that Paul wrote this text?
No, contesting what recension you're basing your argument upon.
Wait. So your argument is basically that Paul did not assert the crucifixion. Am I understanding that correct?
That is not my argument. I'm asking you a foundational question. You're appealing to a source, which is this document, 1 Corinthians 15. I'm asking you, what recension or form of that text are you appealing to?
I'm appealing to, this is the consensus view of what 1 Corinthians says. I mean, there's no textual critic at all. I mean, there's no text fragment of which I'm aware where this relevant section appears where that block of text is not present. And indeed, you do even need this particular. So even if we assume, which no credible scholar would subscribe to, the proposition that this is a later interpolation into the text by a later scribe, even if we were to assume that, I mean, there's so many passages throughout Paul's letters that affirm the crucifixion that it's undeniable that Paul affirmed the crucifixion. So, and it's also undeniable that Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' brother James and his close disciple Peter. And Paul also even represents what he's now preaching concerning the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Christ to be consistent with what's already been preached by those individuals. Because he says in verse 11 of that same text, where then it was I or they, so we preached and so you believed. And so if Peter and James, who were eyewitnesses to Jesus, asserted the crucifixion, then that's very strong historiographical evidence that actually happened, right?
Okay, brilliant, Jonathan. So I listened to you and you said you had to make a couple of assumptions, right? So I'm happy that you're going to appeal to the consensus of scholarship. I guess I could appeal to the Sanhedrin and their consensus on Jesus being a sorcerer, but I prefer not to do that because I prefer to ask questions. So it would seem to me that you don't have any idea about the date of the recension that you're appealing to. You don't want to acknowledge that you have no first century extant sources on this. Would you be willing to accept that on camera, that you don't have any extant first century sources of 1 Corinthians 15?
He states there is no first century source for Jonathan to validate his claim. And I highlighted this tactic of making you go down a particular path in the last response with the following clip.
You want the kind of course of the conversation to go in a very particular path, so that James, when you ask me a question and I give you an answer, you're like, oh no, answer it in this way if you don't mind.
So Ijaz moves towards a nice soundbite which has already been discussed. What point Ijaz is making, I have no clue. So let's continue.
So you're, that's absolutely correct. There are no first century sources of any New Testament. There's no first century manuscript copies of any New Testament document. So that's not contested.
So how do you know then that this chapter goes back to the first century? Help educate me.
So here we come full circle to the point I originally said, and Ijaz asked the question, how do we know this goes back to Paul? Ignoring all historical method which scholars use, such as the timeline of Paul's conversion and Clement of Rome's attestation to build his argument. So let's see how Jonathan responds.
You're equivocating two things. You're equivocating the original autograph and what the original autograph said and the manuscript copies on that original autograph. Obviously, we don't still have the original autograph, But the discipline of textual criticism is attempting to determine what the original manuscript said. And I don't know of any scholar that would assert that 1 Corinthians 15 was an interpolation into the text of 1 Corinthians. Even on the assumption or the hypothesis that you're correct on this, which I don't think any textual critic would back you up on it. But even if you're correct, I mean, you surely wouldn't deny that all of the references in Paul to the crucifixion are later textual interpolations, would you?
So, Jonathan, what I'm doing is simple, right? So we've asked you to bring like primary evidence. You've come on, you've put the secular historians aside. You've said 1 Corinthians 15. So I'm sticking to 1 Corinthians 15. We can look at other passages, and that's reasonable. But here is the question. When you say to me, with certainty, Paul wrote this in these words, I'm sure that you have an evidence for this, right? So if you tell me, well, textual critics say that, okay, how do textual critics arrive at that conclusion? And what is their level of certainty that Paul, in his own hand or an amanuensis, wrote it on his behalf? Like, what is the method that they're using? Because it would be easy for me to say textual critics agree that there is more than one hand to Paul's letters, which is the consensus. So perhaps it is, I could be wrong. Maybe you can inform me just a little bit about the method that the scholars have used to arrive at this 50s dating that you've given us.
So we see Ijaz appeal to ignorance and using conjecture to validate his position. And this is the exact same play he made with Stephen in his debate, which caused him to ask Ijaz the following question.
You want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Repeat that question again.
You want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
I think using probability, it's a high probability that he would have been killed. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, when historians look at continuities in regards to probabilities, they actually point out that things could be outside of the scope of continuities. And therefore, just because something is highly probable does not mean that it is fully possible and therefore absolute.
And this is why, barring absolute evidence, which doesn't exist for pretty much all historical events of antiquity and beyond, we go with the historical method that Ijaz seems to go in the other direction and appeal for absolute evidence. Let's look at this following clip that proves my exact point. When Mike discusses the historical evidence.
There is no smoking gun for the historical crucifixion of Jesus. There are cumulative cases based on pieces, just like any fact of ancient history. Okay, so these are my 8 points of evidence. Number one, and we can go through them. Number one, because these are independent records, whether they're eyewitness, even hearsay is a point of historical criterion used to discover what's historical and what's not.
Now look at those 3 stooges put up their thumbs when Mike says there is no smoking gun for the crucifixion. And then the donkey Ijaz says Alhamdulillah. What a scam. You wouldn't even find this shoddy level of scholarship from an online university based in Timbuktu. And this is why scholars such as Gerd Ludemann wrote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. And Professor Bar Ehrman wrote, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on the orders of Pontius Pilate. And then he has the cheek to say, I don't understand how logic works. Unless for argument's sake, say Paul used an amanuensis, it still doesn't disprove the claim made in 1 Corinthians 15:3 that Jesus died. So Ijaz, maybe if you stop going down this slippery slope and engage in some proper scholarship, maybe you might just develop a plausible historical methodological approach. So yes, Ijaz, you appeal to ad ignorantium. And after everything I've highlighted, this is the same Ijaz that said,
that is how deductive logic works. You make X claim, you follow it with a reason. You make Y claim, you follow it with a proof. And then that leads necessarily to a standard conclusion. That is not the case here. Why? Because when I spoke with Jonathan, he made a claim and he could not qualify it. In response to him, what I did was I cited an evidence. I cited Codex Washingtonianus, and I gave the verse in which it mentions what the statement I made was. So my claim was based on evidence. His claim was not based on evidence. Therefore, I am not appealing to his ignorance. I am appealing to my evidence. So fundamentally, Toilet Paperboy, you don't understand how logic works.
So now this has been addressed. Let's listen to his next point.
The second case, he played a clip where I paused and I asked my interlocutor at that debate, Stephen Atkins, to clarify a question he had asked me. Toilet Paperboy said because I paused to ask him a question, I was stuttering. No, pausing to think is not something negative. I rather answer a question honestly than answer immediately and respond to the wrong question. So I want you to understand here, his criticism of me is that I pause to think, clarify, and then answer. That goes to tell you what his apologetics is like. That involves no thinking or no pause of thought. If the debate is won or lost on a person pausing to speak, then I think I won that debate because you only showed one clip of me pausing. How many times did the other guy pause?
Let us get this straight. The only reason you started pausing is because Stephen got you busted. You probably weren't expecting that question. And I admit, I do agree with you in this case. You did not lose the debate because you paused. You lost the debate when you said,
so using the historical method based on the principle of continuities, scholars would generally say that it is more probable than less probable that he died.
Okay, what is your position on that then?
My position that it is probable, as is the position of all scholars.
You're in a debate called Was Christ Crucified? And then you end up saying it was probable that he died in accordance with scholars. The same scholars who say this is an indisputable fact of history. So what was the point of the debate?
So brothers, grill me on my method, my preparation, what was it like? Because I want people to know that we don't sit around all day playing FIFA or watching Liverpool, a really horrible team play, or watching Liverpool, a really horrible team play.
That's Henderson with the effort. Oh! Absolutely magnificent strike from Liverpool's captain. Simply unsavable. It's 2-0 to Liverpool at Stamford Bridge. It's dreamland.
So Ijaz, I want to ask, a couple of days ago you were saying your preparation, did you say you were reading up to 2,000 pages?
2,000 pages a day, 2,000 pages a day, 2,000 pages a day.
Guys, imagine reading 3,000 pages a day to end up blowing up your own argument in one question. How embarrassing. How pathetic. And then, for some reason, we later see you nodding your head when Dr. Imran said the crucifixion should only be argued on a theological ground.
We understand this is a narrative that you believe theologically, but there's no historical background and foundation for this. So
why didn't you cut him off and correct him and say, "What are you talking about, you buffoon? Didn't you hear me confirm last night the crucifixion probably did happen in my debate?" So it seems that when Dr. Imran speaks, the Dawah team should just mute his mic. I just hope his practice in the medical field is not as shoddy as his logical reasoning. Oh, and whilst we're on this point of historicity, let's listen to how an audience member gets Ijaz busted even more with his question about the historical claims of the Quran.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that as a Muslim you deny that Jesus died on the cross, but you acknowledge that the historical analysis raised the probability was high that he did die on the cross. So my question would be, what is the historical analysis probability on the events as narrated in the Quran of Jesus' crucifixion?
Okay, thank you for your question, Stephen. So what I actually said was that the principle of continuity, that scholars look for repeating events or acts throughout history that allow them to build upon generalizations. In this case, when it comes to the death of Christ, it's nothing special, particularly because he was just one among many other Jews who were crucified, allegedly, at that point in time. if I understand your question correctly, historians generally base their claim on the earlier source as opposed to the later one. And so secularly, the New Testament would come previous to the Quran. And in that case, they would always give precedence to the New Testament. And in this case, because of the New Testament, the probability would be greater for the crucifixion than less. That is not to say that theologians cannot take into consideration that God can reveal a message at any time and that he can confirm that someone did not die.
So there we have it, as confirmed by Mr. Ijaz. The Bible is more historically reliable than the Quran. So I hope when they do their review of the Quran, Christians bring up these pertinent points. In point 3, he says the following.
In the third case, he said, look how Ijaz does history. He goes to the Calling Christians Facebook page and he shows a picture very craftily of me quoting a reverend. And he says, look, Ijaz does history by quoting a reverend. Well, see, I would be wrong, but when was that post made? 6 years ago. That was made in 2014. We were in 2020. I was not as educated as I was back then. But I realized when I went to the post, who was this reverend I was quoting? He studied the history of religion at the Yale University. So I wasn't quoting some guy who is a reverend who got his degree off of the internet, right? He studied at an educational institution, one of the topmost institutions in the world, and he's writing from a theological perspective, and it is quite valid to cite him.
Alhamdulillah. Ijaz, you wrote this article 6 years ago, so that means your knowledge has increased, and your methodology has improved. So with your newfound knowledge and using your historical methodological approach, is Mecca a historical city, yes or no? And by this, I mean using the same criteria and approach you applied to the Bible, such as confirming the attestation using the earliest manuscripts, accuracy of information, being able to demonstrate historical continuity within ancient texts. And this is what the audience would like to know. So I would like an answer for this. I said the scholarship in your article was shoddy because I thought you might mention the lack of archaeological evidence to support this claim, or mention, for example, why Mecca is not even listed in the top 10 oldest cities in Arabia based on archaeological findings. Or maybe you would have explained why none of the local civilizations such as the Sabaeans, the Dedans, or the Kedarians never mention Mecca as a revered city in their inscriptions of Arabian history, or why any 5th or 6th century historians never mention it. So, in regards to the article, Ijaz gives us scholarly citations who cite the same two pieces of evidence. So I was just wondering, how do they authenticate their statements? I brought up the Reverend because he seems to be the deciding factor in Ijaz's argument. So if we skip to the conclusion, we read the following, where it says, from all the evidences which I have presented from objective and academic sources, it can clearly be seen that it is a fact that the Kaaba existed before the advent of Islam and Muhammad. Sealing my arguments, I refer you to Reverend Charles Augustus Goodrich, a Christian historian who admitted that the Kaaba existed and was built by the patriarchs. In his own words, he says, Kaaba, its high antiquity cannot be disputed, and the most probable account is that it was built and used for religious purposes by some of the earlier patriarchs. So once again, for the edification of our audience, with regard to your new historical approach, Ijaz, are you claiming that Mecca is still a historical city? Is this a fact? And can you confirm why? So now let's go back to Ijaz's final point.
At the end of the day, if you're going to make 19-minute refutations, then you need to, one, understand how logic works in the first place. You need to understand how citations work. You need to understand how evidence is used in argumentation.
Okay, the point seems to have slipped his mind. How unfortunate. Maybe Ijaz, you should write your points down next time. And when you do respond, how about you address the fact that you said the crucifixion probably happened based on your historical methodological evidence. Once you confirmed that, there was not much for me to address from your debate in my original response. I mean, at least you could have appealed to the swoon theory, you know. It would have saved you the embarrassment of refuting your own position. So I'll ask again, can you confirm, based on the historical evidence, did the crucifixion happen, yes or no? And on that note, Paperboy signing out.
So using the historical method based on the principle of continuities, scholars would generally say that it is more probable than less probable that he died.
Okay, what is your position on that then?
My position that it is probable.
What an idiot!